Our scientists tell us that we could see the elimination of over half the species of life on Earth by the last quarter or the last decades of this century. We don't know if the human race can make it. This is hard to hear, but we are in denial. 99.5% of all the species of life that have ever been on this little planet have come and gone. Those are not good odds. The elephant in the room is climate change. This is not a issue, this is the defining issue of the human race as to whether we can survive on this planet. We have very little time to make this jump. I mean, if you really take a look at what our climate models are saying and forecasting, back in 2007, the UN panel on climate change said we have about 5-6 years and we've got to transform radically this civilization. We're now at the edge of that time belt. So we don't have much time. We have to make a shift in consciousness. We have to move from geopolitics to biosphere politics quickly. We have to think as a species. We can no longer afford the luxury of thinking in our isolated boxes. But we have to understand we live in an indivisible community, and it's the biosphere. The sheath from the stratosphere to the oceans, where the geochemical and living processes interact in a very complex system dynamic that allows us to maintain this thing called life, this mysterious adventure in the universe. We have to begin to think as a species. We have to think of our fellow creatures as our evolutionary relatives who have a right to be here. And we have to think of the biosphere as that indivisible community. The number one contributing cause, human cause of global warming is not the gas we put in our car. It's the meat we put on our table. The United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization put out a report late last year. It got no attention. And here's what the report said. It turns out that livestock production on this planet contributes more to global warming than all of transport put together on this earth. And we're talking 760 million vehicles. 1/3 of our arable land in the world today is being used to grow feed grain for animals, not food grain for people. We never have a discussion about the fact that agriculture today is responsible for 1/3 of the global warming gases on this planet, and it's never discussed in public policy. It's bizarre. Most people would be shocked to know that 40% of the agricultural land on this planet that's left is used to grow feed for animals. And the FAO and ICGR say that by 20 years from now, 60% of the remaining agricultural land will be growing feed for animals, leaving 40% for the human race. They can't even afford it, the poor. And that shift from food to feed grain allows us to support beef production and consumption on a massive scale and other related animal husbandry. We've got 1.3 billion cows out there. They're taking up 23% of the land mass. They're emitting massive amounts of methane. All of this has been studied. There's so many scientific reports from FAO and everyone else, and no one ever reads them, and the media never reports on it. Methane is 23 times more potent than CO2. So our shift for 60 years into chemical agriculture, the shift from food to feed to support a very limited meat diet for the wealthy, very inefficient, and it's leading to more and more emissions in global warming. So what do we do? What's so sad is after this very good diagnostic analysis of livestock's role in global warming, there's barely a mention of lowering our expectations on the food to a vegetarian diet, and there's not a single prescription about it in the summary. They say rather we should use our arable land more efficiently and more sustainably, completely missing the mark that it's all about eating up high in the food chain. It takes 9 pounds of grain to produce 1 pound of steak. So to me, it's kind of ironic that we are talking about our gas-guzzling cars and how inefficient they are, when our meat production for our intake is much more wasteful and much more inefficient and has a much deeper imprint on the planet in which we live. We should be spending at least as much time talking in public policy about what we do about reducing our intake as we are talking about reducing our use of gasoline and electricity on the grid. Go to the environmental community, among the people that are involved in politics and the business community, which I engage, there's no discussion of this. Zero. Perhaps we need to have a carbon cap, not only for CO2, but we need a cap on methane and nitrous oxide. Let's press the livestock industry. Let's cap it. Why don't we seriously entertain a tax on meat consumption? If we ignore this question of the role of livestock to global warming and climate change, we're not going to get to the promised land. And I have to tell you, there's nothing more sensitive in public policy. They don't want to hear about it. That means the only place this leadership's going to come from in this room, among the animal protection people, the animal rights people, the animal advocates. You understand what's bad for the animals is bad for us. What's good for us is good for our fellow creatures. We got to imprint that in public policy, and we got to scream from the roofs. I wrote a book called Beyond Beef in 1990, and the beef industry in the United States, the security threats were unbelievable. They said, you are out of your mind. Nobody wants to offend our dietary habits. I go to France and mention, they go like this. The Netherlands is big beef eaters. If we're not willing to move down the food chain to ensure our survival on this planet, I don't know what to say. We're going to have to change our diet. This is tough. I know Al Gore doesn't even want to talk about this, but we're going to have to change our diet. It's absurd that we are eating high up on this food chain. The inefficiencies are enormous. The amount of grain that is required to produce a pound of meat could produce 10 times more protein if we used it with vegetables. It's much more inefficient than the internal combustion engine in our moribund old buildings. So we're going to need to find a way to move back from incentivizing feed grain to incentivizing food grain. And we're going to need to have a healthy discussion in the EU, and I mean healthy, on lowering our food expectations on the food chain. Good for our health, good for the environment, good for agriculture, good for the planet. I think that it's a matter of how we perceive our responsibility to each other and the planet we live in. You can't force people by legislation to change their diet. But we do have the responsibility, if we know that our diet is having an adverse effect on in increasing our ecological footprint and creating climate change, we need to talk about it. And here's what I think is a healthy discussion that's happening. We've got a lot of 14-year-old kids, 15-year-old kids all over the world coming home, and they're understanding ecological footprint. I see a younger generation in their teens who have moved from a geopolitical, ideological frame of reference to what I would call biosphere consciousness. They're developing biosphere consciousness, an empathic approach to the future. They're asking mom and dad, why is the water on when daddy is shaving? Too much water. They're saying, why is the TV on to their parents? We're not watching it. Why do we have 2 cars? Can't we car share one? Or the one I particularly like, apropos to agriculture, we have lots of young people coming home and asking their parents, where did this piece of beef come from on my plate? Did it come from a rainforest? Did they have to chop down those trees in the Amazon for 2 inches of topsoil for 3 years to graze the cow? And the kids are connecting the dots. They know that those trees harbor rare species of animal and plant life, and if the trees are knocked down, those plant and animal species die off. And they also know if the trees are knocked down, destroyed, to graze the cow from the burger, that the trees can't be a sink to absorb CO2 from industrial climate change, and the temperature of the planet goes up. This is the beginning of a new generation that understands their connectivity, and so you can't legislate changes in diet, but certainly we are at the beginning of a cultural shift where we can understand that the need to change our lifestyle is important. These kids are learning biosphere consciousness. They're learning ecological footprint. Your generation and mine, that would have been an alien concept. They are understanding that everything we do has an ecological footprint that affects the well-being of every other human, every other creature, every other ecosystem that we inhabit together, that we are immeasurably enmeshed and embedded in a life support system where there's no escape, no autonomy. Our well-being depends on the well-being of the rest of the biosphere. This is biosphere consciousness. Now, will we get there in time? Don't know. Can we find 3 generations committed and mindful to the task of saving the planet? Don't know. What I do know is the technology is now there, and the economic vision and game plan to introduce that technological revolution is there. But there are so many obstacles in the way that we're going to have some good luck, and we're going to have to depend on the human race at one moment at a time to get it together and do the right thing. and start to act as one human family in all of our diversity, and begin to see our biosphere as our community and our fellow creatures as part of the family.